I've been very interested in carbon dioxide removal, and what I've found, curiously, is that a lot of people who've long been in the environmental movement are very suspicious of CDR because sometimes they'll see boreholes because we have to drill and put the carbon dioxide back in the ground. And, you know, there's just a lot of infrastructure that freaks people out. And I was like, why can't we solve everything by planting trees? And even though, my company is called Tree Media, I know that we can't solve all problems by planting trees. I wish that were the case, but it's not the case. And so when I saw this image, this is a fantastic image that you posted from your company about how many minerals it will take for the energy transition. And that's basically the subject of today. So I guess just to start out, just tell us who you are and why you decided to jump into this space of mining and minerals and all of that.
Yeah, so first of all, to introduce myself, I suppose, and then I'll move on to Benchmark Minerals, who I work for. So my name's Adam Webb. I'm head of battery raw materials at Benchmark. What that means is I look after all our research and reports around the raw materials that go into the battery supply chains. So that's things like lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, and lots of other raw materials. How I found myself in this in this space, I studied geology when I was at university many years ago now, and then moved over to Australia and actually worked on mine sites as a geologist for about 4 years up in the Pilbara in Western Australia. But did that for a while and then decided to move back to the UK. But there's not too many mines in the UK, so I took a sideways step into becoming a commodity analyst, basically, which is, yeah, I love it. It's a great career looking into the trends that are driving both supply and demand in various minerals. So that's what we look at. That's what my team looks at, is looking at how much supply there is of these various commodities, how much demand there is, projecting that forward and figuring out what the future price could look like for some of these commodities. And then just to introduce Benchmark Minerals, we are a market intelligence company, and we specifically look at the supply chain for lithium ion batteries. So those are the batteries which go into electric vehicles, but also in your phones, in your laptops, and are increasingly actually also used as storage batteries for renewable energy projects and in people's homes. So we follow that supply chain all the way from the raw material being dug out of the ground, which is what I specialize in, through the refining of that material, its conversion into what we refer to as midstream. So that's like the manufacturing of cathode and anodes. They then go into the battery manufacturing, and then that goes into the end use in EVs. And we cover that entire supply chain, basically. So yeah, that's a brief intro to myself and the company, I think.
Well, I mean, just jumping right in, do we have enough lithium to support the vision of, moving off of fossil fuels and, basically powering civilization with renewable energy? What'll it
Yeah,
take for
so
lithium?
so with all these raw materials, so lithium ion batteries, lithium is a key component in there. The clue's in the name, I suppose. It's in every single lithium ion battery. There are other metals in there, as I mentioned, nickel, cobalt, copper, graphite. But if we focus on lithium, I think that's a good way to look at this. There is plenty of lithium around to fuel this energy transition. I was looking at some figures recently, and the USGS say, so that's the United States Geological Survey, they estimate that globally there is 115 million tons of lithium within resources. So what that means is that's lithium identified in deposits in the ground. Now those have not yet proven to be economical to extract, but they're there in the ground. So that's 115 million tons. We compare that to annual production. Now, last year we estimate there was about 1.1 million tons of annual production. So you can see 1.1 million tons, there's 115 million tons currently identified in the ground. So there's plenty to keep us going for a long time. Now, having said that, supply will increase quite significantly over the coming years. So we're expecting over the next 10 years that supply will increase to 4 million tons in 10 years per year. But nevertheless, there's still plenty of material in the ground. And that number, what happens in this industry is you have exploration. So people go out, try and find new deposits. So that 115 million tons in resources will actually be added to over time. So we're in the lucky position that this energy transition, the most fundamental element is lithium, and that is pretty common in the earth. It's just about finding it in high enough concentrations so that you can extract it economically.
So one of the things I find interesting is just the nuts and bolts of this is, so when you mine lithium, does it sit, is it first of all difficult to mine? Is it deep in the ground, and does it sit in a stockpile somewhere, or does it get used right away? Like, what is that like?
Yeah, so first of all, with the mining, for most of these materials, you're talking about conventional mining. So you identify a deposit in the ground, then you are extracting that material from the ground. There's two ways to do that. Open pit mining, which is basically a big hole in the ground. Some people might, if you think of a quarry or something like that, it looks like that. You're digging off the overburden, then to access the ore body, then you extract the ore. You can also have underground mines, which people might think of, guys with pickaxes or whatever, but these days it's all mechanized. But nevertheless, you access the ore body by going underground. So you wouldn't see much on the surface generally. You'd have a portal that allows equipment to go in, and then you access ore. Then you extract that ore, you take it to a processing facility where usually it's turned into a mineral concentrate. So in that processing facility at the mine site, you're basically increasing the concentrate, the concentration of the mineral you're looking for, whether that be lithium, nickel, cobalt. And you do that by crushing it, grinding it into a finer material, and then undergoing some processes to create a mineral concentrate. That then goes to a refiner where it's turned into like the finished metal. So it could be a nickel metal or cobalt metal or copper. And then that goes further onto supply chains. So lithium is slightly different in that you have that conventional mining route. You also have production from what are called brines. So this is specific to lithium, and conventionally they've been found in South America. So these are saline waters that are highly concentrated in lithium, and it's in the Atacama Desert where it's very dry and sunny. So they pump that up to the surface, put it in evaporation ponds, and then the sun slowly evaporates the water, and then the minerals kind of precipitate out. In that process, you'll have a processing plant on site that refines that into lithium chemicals, which are then used in the battery supply chains. So that's the difference for lithium, is that you have those two different routes. You have the brines and the hard rock. But for most other materials in these supply chains, you just have that conventional kind of hard rock mining.
Interesting. And are these mines sort of generally distributed around the world, or are there some places that have sort of a concentration of lithium? Or does every country have access to lithium? Because I know basalt is like everywhere, right? That I learned with carbon removal.
Yeah. Yeah, so for lithium, yes, it is concentrated in various parts of the world. I would say as a commodity, it's fairly geographically dispersed. So the biggest producer at the moment is Australia. That's all hard rock mining. The material there is mined, converted into a lithium concentrate, then that's shipped to China for onward refining into the battery supply chains. Then you have countries like Chile, Argentina. In those countries, that's the brine operations I mentioned, where you're pumping up the brine, evaporating, etc. And those chemicals are actually generally produced in that country. So the lithium chemicals are produced there, then it goes to wherever into the battery supply chains. And then finally, China is a significant producer as well. So it has its own domestic mining industry for lithium, and it also imports, as I said, material from the likes of Australia. And then you see growing supply coming out of countries such as Zimbabwe, um,
Hmm.
and a couple of other countries in Africa. So lithium, the thing to know about lithium is it was quite a small industry. I was looking at some figures the other day. In 2015, it was about 200,000 tons per year, mostly for glass and ceramics and things like that. And now you look at it and it's 1 million tons per year. And then in 10 years' time, as I said, it's going to grow to 4 million tons a year. So it was previously, when it was that small, it was really concentrated in just a few countries, a few large operations, and then that's starting to grow and spread out geographically. And then for some of the other commodities here, I mean, nickel is highly concentrated coming out of Indonesia. It's responsible for over half of refined nickel production, and cobalt, uh, fairly notoriously, I'd say, is coming from the DRC. So 3/4 of cobalt production comes from the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
So strategically, and I want to get back to cobalt, we talked about that, but strategically, where are the choke points for lithium if, let's say, you're the United States? As you can see, there's a whole shift in the political orientation where, the United States is trying to shore up its trade deals and strategic orientation, and not just for the United States, for Europe too. So is there a concern that this renewable transition might be choked off by certain countries or could
Yeah,
be?
yeah. I mean, the real dominant player in this space across pretty much the entire supply chain is China. So China, although the resources themselves, so the mining is taking place in lots of parts of the world. China has its own domestic industry as well, but I would say the actual mining is fairly geographically diverse. The refining of many of these materials is heavily concentrated in China. So not only the refining of the raw material to the refined product. So for lithium, for example, the material coming from Australia, from the mines, goes to China. It's converted into a lithium carbonate or a lithium hydroxide. Then it goes on to create a cathode. So that's part of the battery. And then that goes into the battery. So it's not only that refining, but that manufacturing of the cathode. And the other side of that equation, so in every battery, you have a cathode and an anode. The anode is generally made of graphite, and graphite is it's even more controlled by China, the manufacturing of graphite and the manufacturing an anode. And then batteries and EVs, China produces way more than anyone else. So that's really the choke point. But we've seen a move at various parts of the supply chain to diversify away from China and kind of secure domestic resources in terms of the raw materials, but also that manufacturing capacity as well. But it will take time. China has been ahead of the rest of the world on this and been developing these supply chains for 20 odd years. So you can't catch up in an instant. It will take time.
I'm just curious, just as a leader or as any sort of corporate leader in heavy industry, why didn't any of the US, European see this coming? I mean, was it just that and it's fine. Look, if we can continue and maintain relations with China, it'd be fine, right? So what was the thinking there? Do you have any idea?
Um, yeah, I think obviously China has a different government system to the West, so it's directly controlled. So things can happen quicker there for that reason, I would say. Um, and yeah, maybe they had a bit more foresight in this and wanted to break their dependence on fossil fuels coming from elsewhere as well. I think that's a key factor, as well as I've been to Beijing a couple of times, not for many years, but back when I went, the smog was really quite an issue. So it's also cleaning up the air in the cities, etc., and also developing domestic um, jobs, domestic supply chains, all this kind of thing to grow the economy. So I think it's a combination of factors really, that have allowed China to move ahead on this compared
Hmm.
to say Europe or North America.
That makes sense. So with the other several minerals, nickel, you say, is in Indonesia.
Hmm.
Uh, it doesn't Russia have some nickel too? I somehow
Yes,
remember
yes,
that.
Norilsk
Yeah,
nickel, yeah.
yeah. And then cobalt, which is the big one for a lot of people, when there's like, oh, your iPhone is made with slave labor. Um, Talk to us about cobalt and how the DRC is mining cobalt, really,
Yeah.
and the artisanal mines and that sort of the difference.
Yeah, I think there's sometimes a misconception around cobalt and the DRC that all of the cobalt coming from the DRC is coming from artisanal mines. When I say artisanal mine, that's not run by a major mining company. It's just some guys turning up with a shovel, or sometimes these can be mechanized operations, with fairly significant equipment. And this is where the whole child labor thing comes in as well, because obviously that kind of situation is not well regulated by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah.
However, I think it's important to understand that the vast majority of cobalt coming from the DRC is actually mined by um, major mining companies. So it's using industrial equipment, so large diggers, large excavators, large haulage trucks. There's big processing facilities, etc. So I think it's important to understand that that is the situation. Whereas sometimes I think from the outside, people think, everything is coming from child labor, which isn't the case. It certainly is an issue, and something that, and it's not limited to cobalt. You see it in other sectors as well, like the gold sector or coltan as well as another high profile one. So it's certainly an issue that needs to be addressed, but it's important to understand that a lot of that material does come from major mining companies rather than these small artisanal operations.
Interesting. And so, and the visual, so I want to get into optics. Mining is very unpopular with people in terms of the optics because it looks so
Hmm.
destructive, right? Um, and I know from my own, I've filmed in a lot of mines, and I know that the people that I meet there are very conscientious about the impact and their operations and all that stuff. And then there are other ones that don't. So it's like anything, there's good
Hmm.
operators and there's bad operators and all of those things. But regardless of how we feel about the optics, we need certain amounts of mining to run our civilization, right? So in this energy transition image, which I'll put back up here, we don't even have all the mines that we need, right? So there's going to be more conflict around opening new mines.
Hmm.
And so how are we addressing that, and can it be done differently? I know it's a pretty big question because it goes from optics to
Yep.
actual mining to what we need, but it sounds like this is just rife for conflict because we need it. It looks like you're destroying the world, but then it's for renewable energy. So, yeah, how do you address that or think about it?
Yeah, I think completely agree with you that in terms of the mining process itself, it's inherently destructive, right? You're stripping off vegetation, you're digging into the ground, you're digging a big hole in the ground, etc. It can be less so with an underground operation, which I mentioned earlier, because you're not having as much disturbance on the surface. But nevertheless, it's a destructive process. However, it can be done and is generally done by the major mining companies responsibly. I think things have changed a lot. 100 years or so ago, people wouldn't have to dispose of the waste material they're producing, for instance, at a mine in a responsible manner. Now there's all sorts of legislation and rules and regulations around how mines operate and do things like that, dispose of waste. As you say, there are good and bad operators, as in any industry, but generally speaking, those listed on stock exchanges, etc., have to have high standards, there is significant financial risk to those companies in not adhering to those standards. It's something commonly referred to in the industry as social license to operate. So if you lose that social license to operate, as in, you lose the support of the local community or local government, there's a real risk your operation could just be closed down. And that's a huge financial implication for a company. So I think there's good intentions because people want to do good things, but there's also financial implications there. In terms of the new mines, that we need to add in that graphic. So we did an infographic just looking at how many mines roughly would need to be brought online to reach projected demand in 5 years' time. So it's only 5 years.
Oh, wow.
And some of the numbers we came up with were 61 copper mines, 52 lithium mines, nickel, I think, was about 28 new mines, cobalt 26. I won't go through the entire list, but you can have a look at the infographic and see. And in just 5 years, that's quite a significant number because to bring a mine online, it's not click your fingers and it will come online. You need years to build these things quite often. You need the capital investment, you need the permitting, then you need years to construct it, to bring it online. And if we look further out from 5 years, those numbers will get bigger.
Yeah.
So absolutely, if people want EVs, phones, not just EVs, renewable energy, the batteries associated with them, as well as the renewable energy infrastructure itself, like solar panels, wind turbines, etc., there will need to be more mines. That's you can't have those without the raw materials to build them. Those mines are going to be located in some of the countries we mentioned, the DRC, Indonesia, Australia, but you will see, I think, operations opening up elsewhere, in Europe, in North America, where perhaps the populations are not so used to having them. And I can speak to that myself. When I worked in Western Australia, there's a huge mining industry there. And I was so to someone, I meet, I work in the mining sector, and they understand what that means. There's no issue there. If I say that to someone in London, quite often I'll get blank looks or horrified looks, and we're so disconnected from that sector, but it's absolutely crucial to the modern world.
Well,
There's
yeah.
no getting away from that.
Well, that's why I'm on this call with you, because I'm really sort of, realizing, I mean, there is where the rubber hits the road, right? I mean,
Yeah.
this is what you want. These are the ingredients.
Yeah. So there are other technologies that people may have heard of, such as one that came to prevalence a couple of years ago was sodium ion technology, for instance, rather than lithium ion batteries. However, that some of this technology is still quite nascent, so it will take time to catch up. Some of it just doesn't have the applications that a lithium ion battery would have. So in the sodium example, a sodium ion battery is generally less energy dense than a lithium ion battery. And you think of where those elements sit on the periodic table, lithium is like the lightest solid element. So you can get more energy from a lithium ion battery than a sodium ion battery, which is heavier. So when I talk about energy density, I'm talking about the amount of energy per weight. Now, when you think of transport, so an electric car, you want as higher energy density as possible. You want to keep the weight down, but you want to get more energy, because more energy means you can go further with that battery. What you don't want is a big bulky battery that weighs an absolute ton, but is going to run out of steam in 100 kilometers. It doesn't work. So there are these other technologies, but I think lithium will be the basis for these batteries that are being used in the energy transition, just simply because of its chemistry, its position on the periodic table. The sodium ion example, that has applications potentially in the storage sector, because there you don't need to worry so much about the energy density. But there are still challenges with something like sodium ion, because the supply chains for some of the raw materials there are not in place. You still need those raw materials. They'll be different, but you still need the raw materials. And then in terms of the lithium ion batteries themselves, we've seen changing chemistry types. So you have some which contain nickel and cobalt, manganese, known as NCM chemistry batteries. And then you've had a proliferation recently of what's known as LFP batteries, which is lithium iron phosphate batteries. At 1.5 years ago, everyone was saying, oh, NCM is going to be take over the world and that's going to do everything. Now it's kind of switched, and LFP, actually, there was some technological advancements in China, and that kind of has made a comeback, and it actually is, we're seeing it as being the most significant of the chemistry types. And that has implications for things like nickel and cobalt, because they're not used in the LFP type. But I think as we move forward, we'll see this evolve more, and new technologies. There's so much R&D going into this space that inevitably there'll be new developments as we move forward.
Hmm. But lithium's pretty much in it, pretty much in all of these things. And what's
Yeah,
striking is what you said earlier, is that graphic is within 5 years, and obviously a lot of this transition is looking at 30 to 50 years. So,
exactly.
but Earth has it all, right? And some people are like, oh, we're going to have to mine asteroids or the moon or all this
No.
stuff. So, how are we doing on Earth? It's pretty much.
Yeah, I mean, I read things about mining the moon and mining asteroids and all sorts. The thing that I think it's interesting technologically, and it's interesting to read about. But when it comes down to the economics of that, I don't think it quite balances out. Personally, I don't think it will happen in my lifetime, so
Got it.
I'm not too worried about it. There's plenty on the earth. I think the other thing to mention, when you look further ahead, 10, 20, 30 years, recycling will become an important part of this story. Um, it it can't be right now because there's not enough. If you think of the growth trajectory of EVs, there's simply not enough end of life EVs to extract all that material and have, it's quite a niche thing at the moment. But as the number of EVs that come towards the end of their life increase, so like your phone, the battery eventually will degrade and will struggle charging and those kind of things, but the material still remains in that battery. So inevitably, there's going to be an industry that develops around extracting that material, and then that will feed back into the supply chain. For lithium right now, I think recycled material we estimate is around 5% of total supply, so fairly small. But if we look forward 10 years, we're talking about 18% of supply.
Nice. And who
So
does the recycling? Who's
uh,
recycling?
specialist recycling companies, basically.
Mhm.
So people specializing in that part of the supply chain.
And where are they located in the world? Mostly China,
I think
probably.
right now, China
Mm,
is heavily dominant, but I'm sure it will develop as the others do.
mm.
I mean, ultimately, yeah, it'll develop where the material is.
It's fascinating to me. Like, so what's being changed so
Yeah,
that those minerals can actually do their job better? Is
so
that
some of my
complicated?
colleagues could probably tell you better than I can, who
Hmm.
specialize at looking at the batteries. But yeah, it's not that the mineral is running out. Like the actual material in there is staying the same. It's just losing the ability to retain and charge and transfer those electrons between anode and cathode. The exact reason for that, I can't help you with, I'm
That's
afraid.
okay. I'm just curious. It's just a strange, these are things
Yeah,
we all take for granted. Oh, the battery, the phone doesn't charge anymore. Getting another
yeah.
phone. Uh, yeah, like why? How, and this is really a field, but it was towards the end of my questions was, is there a decarbonization concern in mining? Because again, when we're looking at
Mhm.
creating a sustainable civilization out into the future that's robust, economically viable, provides jobs, et cetera, and as clean as possible, how do we, or is the mining industry looking at decarbonization of the big machines, all that?
Yep.
because batteries at a certain point don't work for some large machines anyway. So we can look at CDR kind of fuels, recycled fuels, or what's happening there.
Yeah, absolutely. There is as lots of initiatives going on at the company level in the mining sector around decarbonisation of the operations themselves. So I was actually at a conference this week and was speaking to a company called Fortescue, who actually started my career with in Australia. So it was good to see them and see how they're doing. But they've got an initiative to go to what they're calling real zero. So not using carbon offsets, but actually decarbonising their entire operation by implementing the big trucks they use. They've got a fleet of battery driven trucks now. Um, they're using or looking at using hydrogen for energy at the site as well as renewables, so solar power plants, wind, etc. So that's probably, I would say, they're at the forefront of that push. They're really pushing that quite strongly. But all the other major companies are looking at this in the same way. We've seen a proliferation of solar power plants, for instance, across a number of operations, obviously, particularly in countries where there's a lot of sun. Um, and these are huge, huge solar plants that have been constructed to power the mining operation. Now, there may be some backup power from like a diesel generator or something else like that, but it's very much cutting those emissions. But again, some of the, well, a lot of this now is economic arguments in that you invest your capital up front for a solar plant, but then you're going to cut your power costs and cut your operating costs at the mine level. So there's starting to be economic arguments here as well. And in the example of Fortescue, they were saying running those battery trucks is just as efficient um, as running the diesel powered versions. So what's the reason not to do it?
Right.
And as well, a lot of these companies have big ESG disclosures that they have to disclose their emissions every year. And I think questions get asked if those are increasing. So there's all sorts of initiatives going on, I think, across the industry. You know, as we discussed earlier, some companies are more advanced with this than others. Some have the resources to do it, some won't. But there's certainly an effort to decarbonize at the mine level.
Again, it's whatever tech is going to win out in terms of efficiencies and
Mhm.
investment, and it's interesting to see how that is impacting the actual industry. It's providing the ability to have the solar panels.
Yep.
Like
Yep.
it's completely circular right there. Um, and so let's see. Are there any mine? So there, I forgot to put this on the question. Would you mind discussing the Pebble mine in Alaska? Are there any sort of flashpoint mines that have caused problems that were overblown, or it's actually a real concern?
Yeah, there's several, I mean, operations around the world. I'm familiar with Pebble because I used to cover the gold sector for
Mm.
part of my career, and that's perennially um, struggling to get going. But there's all sorts of other examples. In the US, I mean, there is been lots of problems historically for mining companies trying to get permits um, for operations. That varies on state level. So, for instance, somewhere like Nevada, where there is a big gold mining sector, um, often the legislation is much more robust and designed for the mining sector. It's a well understood industry, whereas you go to other states where perhaps it might be the first mine in that state, and there's just not the the public understanding and also the legislation's not in place. So that can lead to problems. But other examples include the Resolution copper mine in Arizona, which is owned by BHP and Rio, so the two biggest mining companies in the world. They've been trying to get that going for years, and it's really weighed down in permitting issues. But outside the US, we had Cobre Panama, which is a big copper mine in Panama. That was operational, and then the government decided to withdraw permits, and it's been shut down, which was a big issue for the operating company, Freeport McMoran. In the lithium space, we've had the Jadar project in Serbia, which Rio Tinto want to develop, but there's been government opposition and some community opposition to that. So there's examples all over the world, really. I think commonly you tend to see it in these places where perhaps there isn't a legacy of mining or an understanding of the industry, whereas somewhere like Western Australia or Ontario in Canada, where there's well-established mining industries, I think you tend to see less of those issues because the people there understand it, the government understand it, there's legislation in place, there's examples, everyone kind of knows where they stand. Whereas when it's in a jurisdiction where perhaps that isn't the case, there tends to sometimes be more problems, which is understandable, I think.
Yeah. Well, in the best case scenario, how should mines operate? I mean, if you were saying this is the best kind of mine practice that's
Yep.
good with the community, it's good with the earth as much as possible. We know that obviously you have to go inside the earth, or so
Yep.
what would be a good example of that?
I mean, there's all sorts of great examples of well-run mining operations with community support across the world. I would say I certainly can't give the mining companies an exact recommendation or how to run their operations. They will know better than me. But generally speaking, I think engaging with the local community, people talk a lot about stakeholders in the industry. So making sure that the mine is beneficial to all stakeholders. So stakeholders would include, the shareholders of the company, but also the local community, the government, the country within which the mine is. So it's, I guess, around talking to those communities, understanding what their needs are. And quite often now, what you see at these mining operations is it's not just, oh, we're going to build the mine and nothing else. There'll often be, particularly in countries that are underdeveloped, there'll be investment in infrastructure like schools, hospitals, housing, all this kind of stuff. So I think often, the mining industry gets tarred with a bad brush. I mean, there has been bad examples, bad operators now and in the past, but a mine coming to an area which has been historically underdeveloped and underinvested in can be a huge opportunity for the people in that community to get jobs, to see the local infrastructure developed, etc. The mine has to also operate in a responsible manner in terms of handling its waste material, making sure there's no issues with water, etc. But for the large part, the major companies are doing that. As I say, there are financial risks as well as reputational risks around not doing that. So, those are some of the things I think that lead to a good mining operation. Then finally, the rehabilitation of the site. For most mines, what they have to do is sink in a certain amount of money each year, which goes into a rehabilitation fund. So at the end of the mine life, there's a pot of money there to rehabilitate the site, basically. So those are just some of the thoughts that spring to mind.
Interesting. But overall, we need mines. We have to coexist with mines, and we're going to have to coexist with more mines if we want the renewable transition to occur.
Yep,
is
absolutely.
The overall message.
Well, a good phrase, I can't remember where I heard this. I definitely stole it from someone. I did not come up with it. But everything around us is either farmed, fished, or mined.
Yes.
I think, and I love that phrase. And it kind of blows my mind, but then you start looking around and thinking, actually, that's pretty accurate. So, yeah.
Well, and with that, I'll end our interview, but I might just call it. Can I use that for the title of?
Yeah, yeah, if you want to.
Yeah, no, it's true, and that's why. Thank you so much, and I might call you back one of these days to catch up with you. This is the first interview that I'm doing in just sort of the nuts and bolts of this future that we're trying to build. And sort of get some realism into the conversation, because it's been very much in a sort of a theoretical or utopic place visually and optically, and we really have to move away from that. So I really thank you so much for.
No worries. Happy to help, and yeah, let me know if you need anything else.